if there are any guests today.
I just came by. I have an individual talking about Amy, she's very important. Introduce yourself to us.
All right. Amy,
Very
welcome.
nice to meet you.
Yeah, welcome.
My guest today is Brian Mack.
No, I won't do it. That's loose on my, I won't do it.
Your boss. Your boss.
Any other guests? Yes.
We got a bunch of guests today. With Beaver and Dollar comes on to the Chapel Town Council.
We got Otis Bugleto and my father, Lou Gonzalez.
Anybody else? Are there any visiting Rotarians? Nope. Nope. All right. I will pass around the fine basket. So the fine basket is you put a dollar in, and it goes to our charitable contributions. Okay. Well, y'all, I'll make this quick, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what I was thinking. Actually, next month in March, I celebrate my 25th anniversary with this club. You would think these people would have better people having a club, but you know, you gotta do what you gotta do, huh? But it made me think about the history of the club. And when you Google the history of East Chapel Hill Rotary, it's actually interesting. So this club, does anybody know when the date that this club was founded? 1968, January 1968. So in January 1968, there is a downtown Rotary Club, and it sounds like, I wasn't there, I don't think Jim Hebner's here either, but he was there. But it sounds like young kids of the downtown Rotary Club kind of threw a revolt and started their own club. That's the best I can get from it. But they started their own Rotary Club?
With Bill Rodney.
That's it? That's it? Was he kind of the head of making this happen? Yeah. Okay. So a gentleman named Phil Rominger was the kind of lead person in making East Chapel Hill Rotary spin off from Chapel Hill Rotary. And that happened, like I said, in 1968. This club quickly got a reputation as being irreverent. Rotary is big on whatever Rotary wants to do, and I don't think the new club was into that. They basically just did whatever they wanted to do and got chastised a little bit for it from big Rotary. So that was kind of their reputation. The interesting part about it was, I just Googled it, I'm not a historian, but when you Google it, it seemed like a pretty contentious situation to where there were votes to whether or not to have a new club or whatever it is, but it happened. Jim Hebner, as a fact, and he's not here today, but he is our only charter member who is still active in coming to the meetings. Jim was the second president of this club, so that's kind of and Jim's probably only 50 years old. I'm not sure. So next thing that happened that comes up in the history of the club is our first woman president. So apparently this was controversial. Our first woman president, obviously, was Christy Jones. The reason it's controversial is before that, it either wasn't, there wasn't gonna be a woman president, or there was a law passed that said there should be women president. Is that how it worked, Christie?
No,
No, we didn't have a woman.
What's that now?
they let women in, and then went to the Supreme Court.
Oh, went to the Supreme Court? So Christie, for those of you who don't know, is Rotary with a capital R. She knows more about Rotary than all of us combined. She's involved at the district level. She is key to our club getting things done. Was just named a hometown hero. So Christy, thank you for all your hard work, and we do have Linda Sanders coming in a few years. The third thing, and I'll make this quick, we started the foundation, which a lot of clubs didn't have or don't have, and not as robust as ours. Dickie's in charge of the foundation. Is he here today? No. Okay. But most clubs may have a foundation, but not as robust as ours. Ours has over $1 million in it, and is really, it assures the future of funding our charitable programs, which is really, really cool. Just make sure that's going to happen a long time. Phil Rominger, again, was key in making that foundation. I think he...
David Kimball was the real point behind it.
So, and then Phil Rominger was one of the earlier...
We had a matching grant for $50,000.
Okay. It's a big deal because most clubs, if they have a foundation, aren't as robust as ours, and ours, like I said before, assures that our programs are funded for a very long period of time. So I'll sum up just by saying the club has always been about fellowship, great speakers, and incredible programs to help our community. And our future is definitely bright. I'll bring up President Felix.
Yeah, oh yeah. You wanna come up?
No, I'll try to speak up. Pat, 25 years, congratulations, that's great. You know, I think your situation with our club is very much like mine, going to UNC. If I applied now, I'd never get it.
But happy President Clark, happy Silver Jubilee. As a matter of fact, in 2028, during Bob Larres' presidency, we are going to celebrate our 60th birthday, and that's gonna be a big deal. And Bob, don't worry, Randy is here to organize all that for you. Good afternoon, everyone. Just amazing that we have a lot of guests, which is very good. I have a few assignments and announcement. One is Bob Ostrom. Do you want to give an update on next week?
Yeah, so we're coming down to your last chance to sign up for the blood drive. I will tell you that it's Wednesday in this very room, Office 6. We'll have Brenda's Pizza, Jersey Mike's, and a $15 gift certificate from Amazon. We're about half filled, which is good, but I'd like us to do better. And I appreciate everyone volunteering as well. And then on top of that, I'm just going to show you this. This is our banner. Never seen it. And we're taking this with us to Dominican Republic next week, and we're going to give them this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Vince is not here, but as you know, Saturday, March 7th, we have the trash litter pickup, and we're still signing up. So if you need to participate, we'll send the sign-up sheet again. And I think this is a great opportunity, especially for our new members, to get engaged in community work. Also, if you look at the slide, I just want to share this good news, and I'll send some information. You can see that our member, our chief, Sarisa Lehu, was nominated for the chairs. Come on. There you go. For the Chairs Award for Public and Private Partnership. All right. The last time we were inducting new members, we ran out of time. So today we have the opportunity to hear from one of our new members, Paige Rubley, who is here. So I'm going to call Paige and Brian, his sponsor, to come. And Paige, you have 60 seconds to talk about yourself.
So I thought I'd just share with you, probably what's more interesting is why did I become vegetarian. So this is the unvarnished truth. In 1997, I married a really tall, good-looking guy, and 4 years prior to that, we've become great, great friends. And for the next 25 years, she taught me to be a better man, a better husband, a better father, a better friend. And even though she became diagnosed with ovarian cancer and had a very stellar corporate career, she created a community service in our village in Middleburg, Virginia, where we lived for 22 years, and helping elderly citizens who were middle class and lower middle class, who lived in a retirement community organized by a foundation, and corralled a bunch of volunteers to cook their favorite home-cooked meals and delivered those meals to them in honor of their service and in honor of their life every Friday afternoon. And it was called Friday's Feast. And we did that. I volunteered. I love to cook. I helped her with all of that. And then 3 years ago, she had to die. And then a year and a half after that, I moved here to Chapel Hill, not knowing anybody. My two sisters, Susan and Frances, like many of you know. Brother-in-law, Bill Ross, and I love all of them very much. My nephew, Lee, and his wife, Helen, and 3 little boys, I love very much. And then over in Raleigh is my 25-year-old son, graduated from State, who I love very much most of the time. And when two very substantive life-changing events happen back to back, especially at older age, you have to adapt. You have to adapt with humility, and you have to reset your expectations. But what doesn't change is what you seek in life, and what I think I share with most of all of you. One is connectedness through the heart. Second is a life of purpose. And third is a life of fulfillment of the choices we make for every moment we have to get to life. And for that end, my shining star is what now is called Donna's Feast, where this time tomorrow between 4 and 5, another army of wonderful people deliver their favorite home-cooked meals to these lovely citizens of Middleburg. For that, I seek the enjoyment of this community, this fraternal organization, and to serve the community that I'm called from. Thanks.
Thank you, Pete. It's an honor to have you. Have I missed anybody else? Announcements? All right. The moment is here. You are in for a treat. And I'm going to call upon Linda to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Felix. It is a true privilege for us to welcome back Professor Klaus Larres. If you have not yet had an opportunity to review the bio in front of you, it is very rich in terms of this man's incredible pedigree, the difference that he has made across the globe with his knowledge in geopolitical situations, relationships between the U.S., China, our relationship across the Pacific, the Atlantic, across the globe. He is a trusted advisor when it comes to NATO and other geopolitical events. It is a great privilege to have you back, Klaus. And the topic, I gotta just make sure I got this right, he might have changed it by the way, is the global order, how precarious it is given the uncertainty of the times in which we live. So Klaus, come on up. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. How's everyone? Good.
Good afternoon.
I love that introduction. Can I ask you to come back and say some more? I think it's very impressive. I like to meet that guy you just introduced. It's really nice to be back here. It's better. Is that better? Yeah. It's really nice to be back here. Thank you for inviting me for a second time. The pressure is on, of course. That means I need to say something which makes sort of sense. I will try, okay? And before I start, I would like to mention the Cluster Global Event Series, that Zoom conversation series I'm doing at UNC. It takes place every 2 or 3 weeks, irregularly, but we have, thank you. We have prominent speakers from the world of diplomacy, economics, journalism, and a few politicians and ambassadors. And I would love if all of you kind of switched on to our Zoom event. And the next one is actually next week. We will talk about Europe and the United States. We will have 2 European scholars. And the week after, we will talk about Russia's frozen assets. And we will have 1 or 2 of the UK's leading lawyers who will talk to us about it, including Lord Banner from the House of Lords. That is in 2 weeks' time, on the 12th of March. And I will send out information anyway, and maybe Linda will be so kind to then distribute it to all of you. However, if you would like to be on my mailing list directly, send me an email or give me your email address after my talk today, and I'm more than happy to put you on the mailing list manually. It's safest, actually. Brian and I were at lunch the other day, and he suggested that I should talk about the world today. You know, a very small topic. So I thought, why not? It seems to be very appropriate. So I've entitled my talk today, The State of the World in 2026 and Europe's Strategic Dilemma between the United States and China. And within the context of the shifting global order. So I hope you have 2 or 3 hours time. As you know, times are not good. There's great uncertainty and unpredictability around. Power politics is back, mostly due to President Putin's activities regarding Ukraine, but also in view of the activities of the current American president. Only last night, Pakistan and Afghanistan went to a state of war almost, and that isn't promising at all. Then domestic politics in all European and in the United States are involved by the Epstein scandal. We will see what will be the outcome, whether more heads will be rolling. In the UK, we've had a by-election only yesterday, and the Green Party, surprise, surprise, took that seat from the Labour, from a safe Labour seat. And that also indicates how unhappy the population of the UK is with the current status quo. And Epstein and the Mandelson affair, of course, has an awful lot to do with that. But let me ask you a little quiz. What happened almost exactly 80 years ago, like on the 5th of March, 1946? 46? 8 years ago.
So wait a minute.
So what happened?
You in?
No, League of Nations, no League of Nations, come on. That was the 20th and 30th. No, NATO was founded only in 1949. It was, well, Winston Churchill traveled to Fulton, Missouri in the company of American President Truman and gave his Iron Curtain speech. It became famous for the phrase that an iron curtain was descending between East and Western Europe. And it is generally seen, with hindsight, as the beginning of the Cold War. Certainly Stalin and Khrushchev and the Soviet Union believed that that Iron Curtain speech was a call for aggressive action of the Western world against the Soviet Union. But Churchill also called further down in his speech, a few paragraphs down, he also called for negotiations and talks. He actually said that he wanted to achieve a good understanding on all points with Stalin and Soviet Union. When we now look at that speech, we focus on the Iron Curtain call rather than on that call for also for negotiations. And I think today we should really proceed with a very similar approach. We should be tough and assertive, but we should also open the door for engagement, for negotiations, not necessarily with the dictators of this world, but with some of their underlings in order to overcome some of the tense situations we find ourselves in. I was at the Munich Security Conference last week, and it was quite surprising how divided people were. You know, some people called for engagement, cooperation, said it's all not as bad as it is, and some people had really given up hope that anything like the tension we see today could be overcome. Right now, the Trump administration is pursuing two difficult negotiation strands. There's first Russia and Ukraine, which the US is trying to mediate in, and there's the Iran negotiations. Let me briefly talk about Russia and Ukraine. I believe we are at a standstill. These negotiations are really for show. There is no indication that Putin is prepared to move towards the end of the war, to make any concessions. He seems to expect that the Ukrainians will falter, that the Europeans will stop supporting Ukraine as thoroughly as they have done. And it is two envoys of Trump's who are involved in that. That is Witkoff, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. Both, of course, have no diplomatic or foreign policy experience at all, and both also seem to be clearly on the side of Putin for largely not ideological, but for economic reasons. It is clear that a deal between the United States and Russia is in their heads, and that means an economic deal. So, unfortunately, I cannot see, and that is really sober news, I cannot see that anytime soon we will make decisive progress with the Ukraine war. There were reports last week that the casualty number on both sides is approaching 500,000 soldiers, with Russian soldiers having killed to the extent of 250 to 320,000 Russian soldiers. And then also between 100 and 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers and also civilians. These are very dire numbers. Both countries find it very difficult to sustain these numbers, but Russia is able to do that more easily because it's a larger country with a greater population than the Ukrainians are. And unfortunately, I cannot see any solution to the Ukraine war before both sides are totally exhausted. The only other solution is if the Europeans were to stop supporting Ukraine. And then, of course, Ukraine would collapse very, very quickly. This, luckily, is not on the agenda. The Europeans have difficulties. They try to make Russia's frozen assets available to the Ukrainians, over $300 billion. They are based in Belgium, but Slovakia and Hungary stopped that process. And they now are thinking, or they have now found 90 billion euro from EU funds to give that to Ukraine for the next 2 or 3 years. But Hungary and Slovakia have at the moment put a wrench into that, and that still needs to be overcome. I'm optimistic that the Europeans will find a way around, the European Commission will find a way around and will be able to support Ukraine with European money, but it still means the war will continue without end. So I think before both sides are militarily exhausted, I cannot see that the war will be coming to an end anytime soon. There was hope that perhaps by the end of this year there would be some sort of mediated compromise deal could be achieved, but I don't think that is very likely at all, unfortunately. Let me turn to Iran. Iran now is also being negotiated about in Geneva. Again, the two guys, Witkoff and Kushner, who seem to be able to do everything. We don't really need regional experts, we just need trusted people Trump can rely on, it seems. They are trying to negotiate the deal with Iran. What is that deal all about? We know that in 2015 we had a six-power agreement with Iran about a new treaty with Iran. That stopped the enrichment of uranium of Iran to above 60%. And you need above 60%, 80% and more to actually produce an atomic bomb. Iran has always claimed it wanted to proceed with uranium enrichment for its civilian atomic energy production. And in 2015, that was accepted. There were a few loopholes in the treaty. It wasn't that perfect and that ideal, but it contained Iran's nuclear ambitions. It was at least the general consensus among experts. In 2018, Trump returned to office, and in 2018, he withdrew the United States from that treaty. Ever since, in his second administration, he's trying to recreate the treaty, which he himself withdrew from in 2018. And last year, in June, we saw attacks together with Israel, 12-day attacks on Iran, and a lot of their underground nuclear facilities were indeed destroyed. And that is where we are at the moment. In the meantime, of course, as you will remember, protests have taken place. They were brutally suppressed by that very dictatorial, fundamentalist clerical regime in Iran. And over 30,000 protesters apparently have been killed brutally, many incarcerated, many tortured, of course. So, of course, we cannot shed any tears for the Iranian regime if it were to lose power. But Trump has now sent an armada, as he calls it, a massive armada to the Persian Gulf, the biggest armada since the Iraq War of 2003. And these ships and warships and two aircraft carriers are waiting there. Only today I hear that the United States has asked the Iranian embassies in the region to send their families home, only to leave the most important people on the ground in their embassies, indicating that an attack may actually be forthcoming very soon. But what are the options? And that is the problem, because an attack on Iran is much more difficult than an attack or the kidnapping of the Venezuelan dictator Maduro. Iran is a country which is almost 5 times as big as Germany. It has 93 million people. Nuclear facilities can be hidden anywhere, including underground. And it is not easy to invade. And of course, as we all know, ground troops are always is not out of the question. What we are talking about is air attacks rather than the deployment of ground troops. And therefore, I believe Trump has boxed himself into a corner. What can he do? If the negotiations should succeed, he can at least claim that he managed to recreate the Treaty of 2015 in some way or other, so that limits the Iranian enrichment of the Iranians. If the Iranians refuse to sign a new treaty, I don't think he has any other option but to attack, probably together with Israel. And even his own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has declared that it would be very difficult, very dangerous, that there will be American casualties, there will be also planes and ships which will be casualties, it will be rather expensive, and success is not guaranteed. But can Trump return and withdraw his armada without having done anything? How would that look to the American domestic population? How would it look to the international community if that was done? So he has to do something. And the whole thing, of course, was totally unnecessary. He did not have to send an armada of ships to the Persian Gulf. negotiations should have been tried much harder and by also much more experienced people. Because you wonder, where is actually the State Department in all that? Shouldn't the State Department be negotiating, and they are regional experts, including the Secretary of State, shouldn't they conduct the negotiations with Russia and Ukraine and also Iran? But the State Department is nowhere to be found because of the Trump administration's unique way of approaching international conflicts. And that unique way is really to rely on envoys, and envoys which are confidants or family members of the president himself. This doesn't promise to be a very successful outcome, neither in Russia nor in Iran. I can't see that the negotiations will be all that successful. So I would say, unless almost a miracle happens overnight and the Iranians are really being intimidated into signing a new agreement, we will see another war in the Middle East. And Trump is, of course, the man who actually promised during the election campaign that he would not get involved militarily in the world, that the forever wars and America's interventionist impulses would not happen under him. But if there is an involvement in Iran, it will be the 7th international involvement militarily of the current president. And so everything he said in terms of being careful about military interventions abroad seems to have been turned around. And we are in a midterm election year, as we all know, so Trump has to keep an eye on domestic opinion, whether or not he can simply withdraw troops or get involved. All that will also influence his decision making. So I'm very pessimistic about the state of affairs regarding both the Russia-Ukraine war and also what is happening in the Middle East. Secondly, let me turn to China. And as we know, though at the moment, there is a thaw in relations between the United States and China. This has two reasons, I believe. The first reason is that China has pushed back against the imposition by the Trump administration of tariffs on China. They restricted the exports of critical minerals to the United States and many other countries around the world, which really showed the United States that China has leverage, that they are not caving in like most of the rest of the world, but that they are actually pushing back. And China, being a very productive country, has of course the means to do that, and particularly because it has a monopoly, almost a monopoly on the production of rare earth. While rare earths, as we probably all know in the meantime, are not actually that rare, they exist in many parts of the world, including in the United States, including in China and Europe, but the production of the refinement of rare earth, that is a big problem. Because if you want to set up refineries for rare earth, it takes years to do so. It's a very complicated process, and it also is very polluting and very bad for the environment. And that explains why there are very few production facilities in the Western world for environmental reasons. And China, of course, needs to care much less about environmental protests and costs and things like that. And it has for years, since Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, carefully planned the build-up of rare earth facilities in its own country. That didn't happen overnight. That was carefully planned. The Chinese actually had a lot of foresight about the importance of rare earth minerals in the future. And the West didn't. Neither the Europeans nor the United States. They basically had a very haphazard policy towards rare earths. And now China, as I said, has an almost 90% almost monopoly on the refinement of rare earth minerals. And that gives it a lot of leverage over the Western world. When Trump imposed 50% tariffs, 75% tariffs, up to 145% tariffs on Chinese exports into the United States, the Chinese pushed back with the rare earth leverage factor. And Trump realized that, and he caved in and reduced tariffs on China significantly. And now we have a thaw. You know, the Chinese stopped the export restrictions on rare earths to the United States and Europe, and Trump came down with his tariff policy. That was one reason why we see a thaw, maybe an uneasy thaw between China and the United States. The second reason is, any guess? It is Trump's forthcoming visit to China, to Beijing. He will be there between the 30th of March, I believe, and the 2nd of April. And for him, this is a highly important visit. For the Chinese, that is a highly important visit. Everyone is preparing like crazy for that. It will be very glamorous, very impressive, and Trump does not want to endanger that visit. So he is being nice to the Chinese. There's a thaw in American-Chinese relations. He keeps quite, he doesn't say that much in terms of critical rhetoric about China. What he has done, though, is he has sent, or allowed to be sent, or he has allowed the Taiwanese to buy additional weapons in the United States. There was a package of worth $11 billion only a few weeks ago, and there's now talk of a second package to the value of $20 billion of weapons which should go from the United States to Taiwan. Of course, these are not grants or presents. The Taiwanese will have to pay for these weapons, but they still need them from the United States. And that has annoyed the Chinese a lot. And both sides have tried to play that down to make sure that that visit by Trump in late March will not be in danger. Let me turn to Europe and China. The German Chancellor Merz has just returned from Beijing. He had, I think, quite a successful visit. And before him, British Prime Minister Starmer was there. Before him, the French President was there. And the Canadian Prime Minister was there. And the Finnish Prime Minister was there. And the Spanish Prime Minister was there. And there are more people going in the future. You wonder, is that all a coincidence? Why are they suddenly all traveling to Beijing? And it's winter, it's pretty cold there. You know, it's not even nice. And of course, it's not a coincidence. They are all rattled by Trump's tariff policy, by Trump's unpredictability, and they are diversifying away from the United States. And that is what the Germans are doing as well. No one wants to and can afford to decouple from the United States. You should keep that in mind. The transatlantic economic relationship between Europe and the United States is still the largest economic relationship in the world. And the Germans, for example, are still exporting more to America than they're exporting to China. Having said that, no one wants to endanger the transatlantic economic relationship, but they're still looking elsewhere as well. That's not a contradiction in terms. You can export to various countries at the same time. So increasingly, they believe, the Europeans believe, reliance on the United States is really not a good thing. You shouldn't put all your eggs into the American basket. Of course, you shouldn't put them all into the Chinese basket either. But they are looking around. And China is an obvious big market for European products. And that is the reason why all these prime ministers are showing up in Beijing, to diversify, to develop other markets more intensely, and perhaps to reset relations with the Chinese. For example, Merz, when he was in Beijing, it was all very polite and nice. There was no word about China being a systemic rival to the Europeans. And that was the talk of the town only a few years back. That was suddenly all forgotten. It was about cooperation and engagement and the development of constructive economic and political relations. And the reason why is pretty clear. They want to be also on the good side of China. Merz himself, however, did complain about a few things. And these things which he complained about are relevant to all European countries. And there are concerns regarding China, because China
is like the United States. It is a selfish great power. Great powers are selfish. When we have America first by the Trump administration, then we clearly have China first by Xi Jinping. And they have pursued it for many years. The difference is actually, Trump tells you straight away, it is America first. The Chinese are more diplomatic. They don't tell you about China first. They tell you about developing the global south, to integrate the global south, to be fair, to have multilateral relations. They talk about a multipolar world. It all sounds nice and fair and equal. But of course, what really is behind it is China first. They think of themselves first rather than of other countries. And this is quite natural. The only exception here is actually the European Union. The European Union doesn't really have a Europe first policy. They try to become a global player, they do things about it, but it doesn't really work. What the European Union wants to achieve is, first of all, stabilize their prosperity, their standard of living, and their social welfare systems within Europe, which, as we all know, is pretty good, but it's under severe attack. Secondly, they believe seriously that they are the global conscience of the world, particularly now with the United States drifting away from that. They believe generally in environmental issues and climate change. They generally believe in human rights and equality and all the nice things we all appreciate, but they are probably the only great power still left which really means what they say when they talk about human rights and climate change, for example. And thirdly, the European Union also believes that it has a lot of industrial power, that it can set industrial norms for the rest of the world and then benefit from that sort of norm-setting quality itself. And there is something in that, and they have succeeded. You know, European, including German industrial norms are often accepted globally because people like that norm-setting standard of the European Union and have taken it on. And then only fourthly, the European Union wants to become a really global player, also a great power. It is increasingly moving in that direction by developing a defense capability, by becoming tougher in global affairs on the world stage. But compared to the China and the United States, they are well lagging behind. And one reason is, of course, there are 27 member states in the European Union. To get them all under one roof is extremely difficult. And there are always a few who are very different. That is, above all, Hungary and Slovakia, but also some other European countries which are not members of the European Union, like Serbia. They never pull in the same direction. So to make the European Union a global power in view of its division within is almost impossible, I would say. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, has done on the whole a good job, but she is a controversial figure. She is not always respected by the other heads of government in Europe, and it's a very tough job for her. While individual European countries have delegated responsibility in trade affairs, in trade relations to the European Union, they have not done the same in foreign policy and defense policy issues. So Ursula von der Leyen doesn't really have much competency in bringing forward a European foreign policy. She needs to coordinate that very carefully with all 27 individual European states, and that is almost impossible. There's been a call that there should be a majority voting on foreign affairs and defense policy issues within the European Union, as well as it happens to be in many other areas. But of course, every individual European country insists on its own foreign policy, and they don't want to delegate any rights about their own foreign policy to the European Union and Ursula von der Leyen. So in the end, I see the European Union will continue to be an important economic and trade partner and power, but in foreign policy terms, in defense policy terms, it will always remain secondary to the real great powers in the world, such as the United States and China. And that, of course, is the problem which the United States, which the European Union has. It is clearly torn between between China and the United States. That old trusting relationship with the United States is clearly, or has become, very precarious, and there is a lot of pessimism in European capitals about the reliability of the Trump administration. In Munich, people were upbeat, and a lot of people, like NATO Secretary General Rutte, he always says, in the last resort, we can rely on the United States. Many other people have much more severe doubts. And the tariff issue is one example where, the Trump's tariffs went up and down and were revised and brought back. Now it's 10%, the day after it's 15%. So it's really something you can't rely on. But at least that's only economics. But in the securities field, can the United States be relied upon to invoke Article 5 of NATO if, let's say, Putin decided to go into Estonia or Poland, or perhaps even non-NATO countries like Georgia or Moldova? How would the United States react? Would they be similarly strong as they were initially regarding Ukraine, or would they look the other way? And there is a division of opinion. No one knows, of course. My own personal hope is, and that is what many people say, no, in the last resort, if there was a clear invasion of Putin into Poland, for example, Article 5 would be invoked by the United States. Maybe that's wishful thinking, we don't know. And even that uncertainty, you wouldn't have had that uncertainty under Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton, Eisenhower, and so on. It was clear that the United States would react supportively. Under Trump, we don't know. And that uncertainty by itself, that unpredictability, that weakens the transatlantic alliance and the NATO alliance, and in turn it strengthens the other side. China knows, of course, what is going on in Western relations and in transatlantic relations, and it tries to bring these European countries closer to its side. Whenever I get interviewed by a Chinese journalist, one of the questions always is, and when are the Europeans going to leave the United States and move closer to us? And I think this is totally illusionary, that is unrealistic, because there are various reasons why Europe and the United States stick together, which go well beyond the current administration. But the Chinese generally believe that economic incentives can bring the Europeans much closer to their side. And personally, I think still values, the history between the United States and Europe, and also the strong economic and security relations really make the transatlantic alliance something unique, which cannot easily be dissolved. But the Chinese see that otherwise, and are quite optimistic that in the end Europe will give up on the United States. And the current traveling of all these prime ministers, which I mentioned before, to Beijing confirms them. They say, well, people are coming, people are thinking or having second thoughts about the United States. And it's difficult then to tell them, no, this is just, just about economics, that's just a coincidence. Let me also tell you more about China. What actually are China's foreign policy objectives? And it is difficult to know, because while American politicians, European politicians tell you a lot in interviews, in speeches, even confidential information is often released, national security strategies are released. That is much less the case in China. We have some official papers, but it's all very wishy-washy. So it's actually difficult to know what the Chinese foreign policy objectives are. And I believe we can still differentiate among 6 of them. First, I think China clearly wants to rise further economically. It wants to become increasingly prosperous and become possibly the world's leading economic power. Secondly, China clearly wants to become the leader in the knowledge industries, including high-tech, AI, pharmaceuticals, chips and semiconductors, EV vehicles, robotics, and many more. Thirdly, it also clearly wants to become the undisputed hegemon in the South China Sea and make sure that the US withdraws from what the Chinese see as their near abroad. The ideal objective for the Chinese would be that the US ceases to be a specific power, but they certainly want to push the United States and other Western countries out of the South China Sea. That is what they see. Like the US sees the Atlantic and its ocean, the Chinese see the South China Sea as their own ocean, and they don't want to tolerate any foreigners being there. Fourthly, the Chinese want to ensure that Japan, South Korea, and the United States accept China's predominant position in East Asia. That is related to that South China issue. Clearly, they want to be the hegemon in that part of the world. If Trump talks about the Western Hemisphere, that the US should dominate the Western Hemisphere like South America and the Caribbean, the Chinese definitely want to be in charge of East Asia and not have the United States meddle in that part of the world or have close alliances with Japan and South Korea. Fifthly, clearly the Chinese want to unify Taiwan. I don't think that an invasion of Taiwan is around the corner. I don't think that any action Putin takes or Trump takes regarding the Russia-Ukraine war will actually influence the Chinese. I think it is a much more hard-nosed calculation. The Chinese will ask themselves, are we militarily capable to take over Taiwan without too many losses, without a prolonged war like what happened to Putin in Ukraine? And I think the answer today is still no or not sure. And the risk is still pretty high that a violent takeover of Taiwan would really blow up the whole region, would counter or would run against Chinese prosperity and economic prosperity. So I don't think that we see or that we have to fear that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is around the corner. It cannot be excluded in the mid to long term, but I don't think it will happen this year or next year or any time close. Also, the Chinese still expect that they can bring Taiwan to heel by economic means, even by cultural means. So when we say the Chinese always play for time, they believe they are, or we believe they are much more patient than we are in the Western world, I think regarding Taiwan that seems to be quite correct. While Xi Jinping, of course, would love to go down in history or in Chinese history as the guy who brought Taiwan back and unified the country, which Chinese leader wouldn't like that legacy? But he doesn't want to have the legacy of blowing it all up, of making China the pariah of the world and undermining its prosperity. That is the risk he would run if he tried to become a hero in Chinese history. And I think he is by nature quite cautious, as are Chinese policymakers. They're not rushing into things, they're quite calculating. So on the whole, I would say, yes, Taiwan is in a precarious situation. There will be pressure on Taiwan, or also military pressure, economic pressure, but I wouldn't expect an outright invasion and maybe a world war developing because of that, depending on how the United States will react. Then sixthly and lastly, the Chinese clearly want to increase their influence in the global south. They see themselves as the leader of the global south, what we call the developing world. And China sees itself still as a developing country. Of course, when we travel to Shanghai and to Beijing, you think, really? See all these high rises, how can you possibly be a developing country? But when you go to the countryside, when you go to rural areas far away from these major metropolises, then China is still, a rural country, is still a poor country. Not as poor as it was 20 years ago, obviously, but the Chinese claim to be still a developing country is not totally without value. and they see themselves as a developing country and as a leader of the developing world. They're competing here, in particular with India, for example, and they have a very competitive relationship with India. But being the leader of the Global South helps them also beyond that. It increases their credibility, it increases their image, and they want to set themselves up as a pole of stability in an unpredictable world. And they increasingly succeed with that. You know, when you listen to what is coming out of the White House, and then you listen what is coming out of Beijing, it's like turmoil and chaos and calculated, stable policy making. Behind the scenes, of course, we don't know what is happening in Beijing, but for outsiders, you know, China seems to be reliable, predictable, they're not changing their policy overnight every 2 days. You know, so their self-imposed reputation that they are stability and reasonable and predictable is difficult to refute, and particularly for countries which are also economically dependent on China, like many countries in the Global South. I just want to finish, yeah? So, let me come to a conclusion. I think China is still the problem we have to deal with most in our world, despite the current thaw. China is a real competitor and rival. While the war with Russia, what is happening in Iran is of course terrible and is should be dealt with as a matter of urgency. I think when we look into the future, these are not the major problems. The major problems is really how to obtain peace among the great powers of the world. Because if war really erupts regarding Taiwan, we will be close to a third world war. With Russia and with Iran, it's terrible enough, you know, but I don't think it will ruin the world. And therefore, I think we need to spend a lot more attention to China, Europe, China, US relations than we seem to do at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus. This is interesting and enlightening. I have a question for you. How would you assess China's long-term strategies in Africa compared to the traditional model of the Western world?
Well, China has been much more forward-looking regarding Africa. Until recently, both the United States and Europe neglected Africa. It was a continent where exported some products to and obtained some raw materials, but it didn't really feature very large. It featured large in decolonization debates, but that was more of a scholarly or historical interest, not really for let's say, captains of industry. The Chinese set up their new Silk Road, their Belt and Road Initiative, and they went to Africa in order to make themselves the leader of the Global South. And only once the West realized that China was so active in Africa and setting up also very productive bilateral relations, then the United States and Europe woke up and became more active with their Africa policy as well. But the Africans themselves, of course, noticed that the Europeans and the Americans were only reacting to what China was already doing. So the credibility of the United States and Europe in Africa is much lower than the one by China. There have been some scandals regarding China, what we call trap debt diplomacy, that the Chinese deliberately ask African countries to take up too many loans which they can't really afford to pay back. That makes them then dependent on Chinese diplomacy. It is difficult to know whether that really was an intentional plan or whether that happened in due course. But the fact is, many African countries are much more dependent on China, have much better relations with China at the same time than with the United States and Europe. Some experts think the West has lost Africa. There's no chance to really become important again or influential again on the African continent as compared to China.
Yes, my question is about Trump's Board of Peace and its relation to the United Nations. What your view is on that?
Yes. Personally, the United Nations is a little stuck because the Security Council is blocked by possible or potential vetoes by both China and Russia. But there's no substitute to the United Nations, and the Board of Peace is certainly not a substitute. You know, it was only frequented by partially very unsavory dictators. It has a chairman who shouldn't be the chairman, and who even for work reasons, how can he do that? If he really wanted to turn that into a sensible job. Also, the Board of Peace was meant to be for Gaza initially, then its remit got extended to the entire world. But important European countries, including France and Britain, have refused to participate. And I think it is a show, like the negotiations for Russia, with Russia and Ukraine are really a show and not much more. So you can claim to have something like a global leadership, but I don't think it will lead to anything. It will not disappear overnight, but in due course I think it will just be forgotten about. Yeah. What is much more important is that we save the United Nations. And the reform of the Security Council has been attempted many times, is on the agenda for many years. Particularly Japan should get a seat, the European Union should get a seat rather than Britain and France. But if you were the British Prime Minister, would you give up your seat? Probably not. So it is stuck. But a reform of the Security Council, that is what we should really attempt very, very seriously, and perhaps also of the General Assembly, because sometimes there's utter chaos in the General Assembly, and you can predict easily how votes show up. But I believe in principle that the United Nations still should be saved and should be dealt with.
Yeah. Yes. Is it right off base by a thing you just described, transactional analysis? Everything is a transaction. The values, the deep-seated feelings are all subject to, it seems to be an increasing attention to what's going on exactly right now, to wit our decisions in Venezuela and those kind of things. But all the transactions are now just transactions, without any killing or, we're just waiting for the next deal. Am I off base with that?
Well, yes and no. I don't think that China is transactional. I tried to indicate that they have become superior to us, at least to the United States, by not being transactional. There is some calculation, there is some strategy and some long-term thinking. With the United States right now, this is absent, I think. We don't see that. In Europe, it's not totally absent. I think when Merz went to China, that was calculated. That was not just transactional, that was looking into the future, and other prime ministers as well. But in the United States, I would say at the moment there is not much reflective thinking going on. And as I say, with the business, if the business is difficult at the bottom, it usually has something to do with the CEO, that it comes all from the top down. And that is what we are enduring at the moment in the United States. But that doesn't mean it's going to last forever. In a way, I'm an optimist. There will be a revulsion at the midterms, there will be a revulsion at the next election, particularly if the economy is not miraculously improving a lot. And there will be more reflection again. We've had bad periods in American history before, and think of the Vietnam War, the chaos induced the civil rights movement, what that meant for the government of the day. Think of the anti-communist activities in the late 19 after the Versailles Peace Treaty, after the First World War, where also communists were arrested pretty randomly, as now immigrants are often being arrested pretty randomly. And the country did recover from that. It took some time. Think of the Depression, 1929, and the New Deal, and all that. So I'm not totally hopeless that will again be the case. But it will be a very long process, and it will take some time. And by that time, and that is what I fear, by that time, China will have run off, and will have, they're not sitting still waiting for us to recover. There's an article in the Financial Times today about Chinese universities, the rise of Chinese universities. And they are rising very, very fast, not least because lots of money is being made available. We are cutting the money to research at universities. So it's not like that, other people are becoming very good, but we are also helping to hold ourselves back. And I think that is the danger, really. I don't think that the US will go on forever with that transactional policy of today. We will recover, but it may be, not early enough. It may be too late to some extent. Yeah. And the same applies to the Europeans. The European situation is not promising either. There's infighting. There's a bad economy, and they are torn, as I said, between the United States and China. So they are, in a way, all over the place as well. Less transactional, but they feel they're squeezed by both the United States and China. And that's not a recipe for success either.
Thank you so much.
Okay.